Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. The hum of fluorescent lights above flickered, casting a dull, sterile glow over the operating room. Dr. Ethan Carter stood at the head of the table, hands steady as he guided the surgical tools with practiced precision. Sweat beaded on his brow, his mind wholly focused on the task at hand. A triple bypass. The heart monitor beeped in time with the rhythmic pulsing of his patient's heart, a fragile yet hopeful reminder of life. But Ethan's mind was racing. Despite his outward calm, he had been a surgeon for over a decade now, and the routine of these life or death procedures had become almost mechanical to him. He'd saved countless lives, repaired torn arteries, reconstructed mangled limbs, yet something felt hollow. Each victory in the or seemed to blur into the next, leaving a void where satisfaction once thrived. He hadn't imagined medicine would become this way when he first donned the white coat, but there it was, an emptiness he couldn't shake. Just as he made the final suture, a vibration at his waist pulled his focus away for a brief second. A message. His phone. Unusual. The hospital staff knew better than to disturb him during a procedure. He finished the suture, looked up at the anesthesiologist, and gave a curt nod. Stabilized, Ethan said softly. The team around him relaxed in unison, as if releasing a collective breath. The patient was going to make it. Ethan removed his gloves, wiped his brow, and stepped back from the table, glancing quickly at the message flashing on his phone. Urgent meeting. Report to conference room 314. The sender was blocked. No name, no identification. Ethan frowned. It wasn't the first time he'd received cryptic messages in the last few months, though most were easy to dismiss. This one, however, had a different tone and authoritative urgency that made his pulse quicken. The conference room was a sterile space, all white walls and polished steel furniture. It felt more like a corporate boardroom than part of the hospital. Ethan hesitated at the threshold before pushing open the heavy door. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, but it certainly wasn't what he found. 4 people sat around a central table, their eyes fixed on him the moment he entered. 3 of them were dressed in dark, professional attire, serious expressions, no-nonsense stances. The 4th was different. He wore a silver-gray uniform, sleek and unfamiliar. His presence radiated authority, but not the bureaucratic kind. This was something else, something deeper, as if he carried knowledge that would change the course of events. Dr. Carter, the man in the uniform greeted, standing up. Please, sit down. We have much to discuss. Ethan remained frozen for a moment, unsure. His eyes flicked between the strangers and the uniformed man, trying to decipher the situation. Reluctantly, he took a seat. You've been selected, the man began, his voice firm, deliberate. We're offering you the opportunity to join an elite unit, one that operates outside the bounds of typical medical practice. What we do is confidential, but I assure you, it will challenge everything you know about medicine and time itself. Ethan blinked. Time itself? The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Humanity has developed the ability to travel through time. We've formed a team, the Space-Time Medical Team, dedicated to providing medical assistance in critical historical events that would otherwise suffer greater loss of life. But there are strict rules. We do not change history, Dr. Carter. We simply save lives. Ethan leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of the proposition settle over him. Time travel. This can't be real. It's very real, the man said, his gaze unwavering. We've carefully selected the best of the best. And you, Dr. Carter, are one of the finest surgeons alive. We need your skill. He paused, letting the gravity of the situation sink in. Imagine saving lives not just in the present, but across time. The Black Death, the wars of the future, earthquakes that claim thousands. You could be there, offering aid where it's most desperately needed. Ethan's mind whirled. The concept was ludicrous, and yet a broken bar something in the man's tone, in the way the others remained silent, watching him, told him this wasn't a joke. It was an offer. And he had to make a decision. If we do this, Ethan said carefully. "We can't alter history." "How is that even possible?" The man in the uniform nodded. "We have strict protocols. We work in secret, always in the shadows. We remove any trace of our presence, leaving nothing behind but healed wounds. It's a delicate balance, but we have the technology to ensure our interventions leave no mark on the timeline." Ethan exhaled slowly. The opportunity to save lives across history? It was overwhelming, yet enticing. How could he say no? "When do I start?" he asked, already knowing the answer. The hum of the time machine was unlike anything Ethan had ever heard. It wasn't mechanical, it was deeper, as if the sound itself resonated in the bones, vibrating through the fabric of reality. He stood inside the machine's chamber, watching the holographic display ripple with data. It felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, peering over into the abyss of time itself. Beside him, Dr. Myra Patel, a fellow surgeon and the STMT's lead medic, glanced at him with a reassuring smile. "Don't worry, the first jump's always the weirdest." Ethan nodded, though his pulse pounded in his ears. His nerves were on edge, but the anticipation was undeniable. In front of him, the mission coordinator, clad in the same sleek uniform as the man from the meeting, keyed in the final details of their destination. "First mission, the Black Death, 1347, Central of Europe," the coordinator announced, his voice crisp. "Your objective is to provide medical assistance to plague victims while maintaining the cover of local healers. You will be equipped with antibiotics and tools that match the period as closely as possible. Remember, no interference with the timeline. Heal, but don't alter." Ethan swallowed hard. The plague. Millions had died in agony during one of the darkest periods of human history, and they were about to step into it. The time machine activated, and everything shifted. It wasn't like a sudden jolt or a rush of speed. Instead, the world around Ethan seemed to dissolve, bending and warping in on itself. One moment, he was in the sterile chamber. The next, the air was thick with the smell of death and decay. They had arrived. The village was a place out of nightmare. Bodies lined the streets, bloated and covered in blackened sores. The air was heavy with the stench of rot and despair, the cries of the dying echoing in every corner. Ethan's heart lurched at the sight. This was far beyond anything he'd ever imagined. "Stay close," Myra said, adjusting the makeshift mask over her face. The team's uniforms were disguised beneath cloaks and garments that matched the era, giving them the appearance of traveling physicians. They moved quickly, setting up a temporary clinic in the shadows of a crumbling church. The antibiotics they brought were a miracle to the people of this time, yet though they could never know it. Ethan worked quickly, applying salves and performing incisions to drain the bows of infection. Each patient was treated with meticulous care, though the team was haunted by the knowledge that they could only save a handful. The plague was relentless, and their supplies were limited. Ethan found himself staring into the hollow eyes of a young woman, her face pale and gaunt. She couldn't have been more than 18. Her hand, cold and trembling, gripped his as he worked. "Will I die?" she whispered, her voice hoarse and frail. Ethan hesitated, searching for the right words. The truth was cruel. He could save her, but the plague would continue its grim march through Europe. Regardless of his efforts, thousands more would die. Millions. "No," he said softly, offering a gentle smile. "Not today." The treatment worked, but only temporarily. The team had to move quickly, their presence already drawing attention from the locals. Word spread of healers who performed miracles, and soon the village priest grew suspicious. The last thing they needed was an accusation of witchcraft. "Time's up," Myra said, her voice tense. "We need to leave." Ethan nodded, his hands stained with the blood and filth of the past. They couldn't stay. They couldn't save everyone. As the time machine whirred to life again, transporting them back to the present, Ethan's thoughts lingered on the faces of those they'd left behind. "Welcome back," the mission coordinator said as the team stepped out of the time machine, back in the sterile chamber of the present. Ethan's legs wobbled slightly, still adjusting to the shift. The weight of what they had just done and what they hadn't pressed heavily on his chest. "How do you get used to that?" Ethan asked Myra, his voice low. Myra shook her head. "You don't. You learn to live with it." The air was thick with smoke and the scent of burning metal. Ethan stood amidst the ruins of a future battlefield, his pulse quickening as the distant sounds of gunfire and explosions echoed through the desolate landscape. The future was nothing like he'd imagined. Here, in the 22nd century, war had evolved into something unrecognizably machines against machines, I against humanity, and in between, bodies lay broken, their cybernetic enhancements only making the devastation worse. His medical bag felt heavier than ever as he moved through the wreckage, scanning the area for survivors. Dr. Myra Patel walked beside him, her face grim as she surveyed the scene. She had been on these missions long enough to know what was coming, but even she couldn't hide the unease that prickled at the edges of her composure. "Over here," one of the medics called, crouching beside a fallen soldier whose chest had been blown open by some kind of energy weapon. Sparks still sputtered from the exposed circuitry woven into the man's ribcage, mingling with blood that seemed almost out of place in this dystopian future. Ethan knelt beside the soldier, examining the damage. It was a gruesome mix of flesh and machine, and the technology was far beyond anything he had encountered before. But flesh was still flesh, and he knew how to save a life. He injected a stabilizing serum and set to work, delicately separating the cybernetic components from the human tissue, hoping to stem the internal bleeding. "Easy," Ethan murmured to the soldier, whose eyes fluttered open for a brief moment. The man's breath rattled in his chest, his augmented lungs struggling to function. "Will we win?" the soldier rasped, his gaze flicking toward the horizon where the battle raged on. Ethan followed his line of sight and saw the towering silhouettes of AI-controlled war machines advancing, their weapons tearing through what was left of the human resistance. Ethan paused, unsure how to answer. The truth was, this war wasn't theirs to fight. They were here to save lives, not change the course of history. But the weight of the soldier's question hung heavy in the air. "You're going to make it," Ethan said instead, focusing on the task at hand. He wasn't here to deliver false hope about the war's outcome. He was here to save this man's life. The soldier coughed, a thin trickle of blood escaping the corner of his mouth. Ethan worked faster, his fingers steady despite the chaos around him. With Myra's help, they managed to seal the wound, patching the man together with a combination of futuristic biogel and the more familiar staples of surgical precision. "He'll live," Myra confirmed, wiping sweat from her brow. "But we've got to move. We're drawing attention." Ethan glanced around and saw what she meant. Drones hovered overhead, their red eyes scanning the wreckage. It wouldn't take long for them to zero in on the team's position, and if they were found, the mission would be compromised. "Go!" Myra shouted to the rest of the team. They grabbed their equipment and hurried toward the extraction point, where the time machine waited, hidden within the ruins of what once had been her hospital. Ethan lingered for a moment, his eyes fixed on the fallen soldiers they couldn't save. The faces of the dead human and cyborg ally Kia blurred together, each one a reminder of the lives that slipped through their fingers. They hadn't been on this battlefield for more than an hour, but it felt like a lifetime. Back in the present, the sterile hum of the time machine faded, replaced by the silence of the return chamber. Ethan exhaled slowly, leaning against a cold metal wall as the adrenaline drained from his system. Each mission was becoming more and more difficult to reconcile. The idea that they could save lives, but never enough. Never all of them. He wiped his hands on a clean towel, but the grime of war seemed to cling to his skin, invisible yet ever present. "We did what we could," Myra said, sensing his unease. "That's all we can do." "I know," Ethan replied, though the words felt hollow. "I just wonder if it's enough." She didn't answer, and maybe that was for the best. There was no answer, really. The space-time medical team wasn't about solving the world's problems or stopping wars. It was about being a small light in the darkness, saving a few lives while the rest of history carried on, unchanged. The next mission came quicker than Ethan expected. He had barely returned home yet, if his sterile apartment could even be called that, when the call came. Another disaster. This time, it was modern-day San Francisco. An earthquake of catastrophic proportions had hit the city, and the STMT had been called in to provide emergency medical aid. Ethan barely had time to pack a few essentials before he was back in the briefing room, the mission coordinator running through the details with a clipped efficiency that mirrored the urgency of the situation. Magnitude 8.5, the coordinator said. The city's in chaos, thousands of casualties. Your mission is to establish a field hospital and treat the critically injured while remaining undercover. We can't let anyone know who we are or where we came from. Ethan nodded, already mentally preparing himself for the devastation he was about to witness. Earthquakes were unpredictable, ruthless, and this one had hit one of the most densely populated cities in the world. When they arrived on the scene, the destruction was worse than Ethan had imagined. Buildings lay in rubble, streets were cracked open like jagged scars, and fires raged uncontrolled. The air was thick with dust and smoke, and the cries of the injured and trapped echoed from every direction. The team moved quickly, setting up a triage center in what had once been a parking garage. It was one of the few structures still standing, though it groaned ominously with every aftershock. Ethan worked tirelessly, stitching wounds, setting broken bones, and treating crush injuries as fast as his hands would allow. At one point, he found himself kneeling beside a young girl trapped beneath a collapsed section of concrete. She couldn't have been more than 10 years old, her face smeared with dust and tears. Her leg was pinned, the bone shattered, and every time the ground shook, her scream cut through the chaos like a knife. "Hold still," Ethan said softly, trying to reassure her as he prepared a splint. The girl's wide, terrified eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, he saw his own daughter in her. It had been years since Ethan had seen her, his life too consumed by his work, by the missions that kept him moving through time and space, always away from home. "Is it going to hurt?" the girl asked, her voice trembling. "A little," Ethan admitted, carefully maneuvering her leg. "But I'm going to make sure you're okay." He gave her a local anesthetic, numbing the pain as best he could before setting the bone. Her small hand gripped his as he worked, and when he was done, she gave him a weak, tearful smile. "Thank you," she whispered, before the paramedics arrived to take her to safety. Ethan watched them go, his chest tight with emotions he tried to push away. This was why he had joined the space-time medical team, to save people who otherwise wouldn't have a chance. But each mission left a little more of him behind, and he wasn't sure how much more he could give before there was nothing left. The team returned to base after hours of relentless work, their bodies and minds exhausted. But there was no time for rest. Another mission awaited them, this time in an ancient civilization, one teetering on the brink of destruction. A volcanic eruption of massive scale was about to wipe an entire society from history, and they were the only ones who could help. Ethan didn't know how much longer he could keep doing this, how many more missions he could endure. But when the time machine activated once more, and the familiar sensation of the world dissolving around him took hold, he knew he wouldn't stop. He couldn't, because in the end, saving even one life was enough to keep going.